and they were from South America, and they were then joined by Taino, who came from Central America. These were peaceful villages, farmers. In fact, one of the explanations for the etymology of the word Cuba is that in Taino it meant where fertile land is abundant. The Taino had houses made of palm thatch. And the population was, I have 200,000 here with a question mark, because some estimate it was as much as 350,000 islanders living when the Europeans came. And we'll fast forward a little to the age of exploration, which brings us to Columbus. Now, Columbus had been at sea since he was a little boy. He was a son of a merchant. His father traded in wool and cloth. And with him, Columbus had already sailed to Ireland and Iceland and down the coast of Africa. He was a very experienced and brilliant navigator. And he knew he could get to Asia. What he didn't realize is that the Americas were in the way. But now on his first of the 4 voyages, now we're looking at the purple, Columbus comes here into the Bahamas. And then he came down and explored this coast of Cuba here in the east, in many different spots. Goes down to what we now call the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and then went home. So on his first voyage, he goes to Cuba, and also on his second. But what he wrote down in a letter to the King Ferdinand, was this: "The shores are embellished with lofty palms, freshness in the air, birds and flowers, uncommon and beautiful. Believe me, sire, these countries far surpass the rest of the world in beauty." Columbus was stunned. He loved it. And as with his agreement with Ferdinand and Isabella, he claimed all of the land he came to for Spain. And so by 1493, Cuba was a Spanish colony and remained a Spanish colony until 1898. 505 years of colonial domination by one country. That is a very, very long time, especially when we consider the British occupation of the 13 original colonies, far less time. On his second voyage back to the New World, Columbus does something very interesting. He stopped in Madeira. He was married to the daughter of a sugar planter. And when he saw Cuba and saw the climate, he thought, I think sugar cane would grow well here. And so on that second voyage, he brought plants, sugar plants, and he also brought planters with him, people who knew about growing sugar cane. And so when he comes back to the Caribbean, this begins the plantation of sugar. But Cuba was never a place where they had like a single crop. Cuba was diversified from the beginning because coffee also grew well in Cuba, and so did tobacco. But all of these crops needed a lot of labor. They required the importation of slaves, and consequently, starting in the early 1500s, African slaves were brought into Cuba. Now there's an old saying that among these European countries that were trying to grab colonies in the New World, the first thing the Dutch built was a school. The first thing the Spaniards built was a church. And the first thing the British built was a tavern. Not sure if that's 100% true. But from the beginning, Cuba becomes the administrative heart of the Spanish Empire in the New World. It was an urban economy primarily. It never supported itself completely by agriculture. But it had a lot of interesting cities. Havana, the primary one. Trinidad, Baracoa, Santiago de Cuba. All of these cities, very important to the Spanish Empire, important ports themselves. They have beautiful architecture. And so Cuba had a special place. It attracted and it needed brilliant administrators who came out from Spain, architects, people who were going to be developing the New World, accountants, people who were taking charge of these ships that were going back to Spain. In 1620, when the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, the Spanish Empire looked like this. Spain already had colonies, in the Philippines. They had colonies and settlements down the coast of Africa on both sides, in India, all through North America and South America. The Spaniards had explored Alaska at this point, even. And they were trading for silk. From these colonies in Philippines, they were trading with China for silk. And those products were going across the Pacific Ocean to Panama and then being transported to Cuba. Now, of course, whenever you have goods traveling over water, you have pirates. And early Havana was plagued by French pirates who were always very well dressed, you'll see. The French always dress well. Now, but they were, the port of Havana was looted several times by French pirates, and so they realized they needed to have some fortifications. And we will see these fortifications immediately as we approach the island and when we go through the canal there. Havana eventually became a walled city. And this part of Havana that we call Old Havana was the part that was enclosed by the wall. And so, Havana becomes the jewel of the New World, the jewel of the Empire of Spain. And they say location, 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 and you couldn't get better than this for the navigators going back to Europe. Havana and San Juan, Puerto Rico, interestingly, are the only major Caribbean ports on the Atlantic side. And consequently, it was pretty easy to get. You didn't have to thread yourself through all of these islands. You kind of had a pretty much of a straight shot back to Spain. So it made these ports even more important. Now, for hundreds of years, there was a convoy system. The Spanish treasure ships would come from the south and meet in Havana. And then every spring, 30 to 90 ships, under the protection of warships, would go back to Seville, to Spain. This was a response to the pirates who were constantly trying to get at those Spanish treasure ships. But those ships were, full of treasure. Silver, gold, gemstones, pearls, tobacco, lumber, and also the spices and silks from the Pacific. And so here you see this route. The goods from Asia come here to Panama, and then they're transported over to Havana. The goods from Mexico, from Peru, up here. and then they all went back to Spain. And in the fall, the fleet would return with all of the things that were needed, the supplies for the people in the New World. This was the first permanent world trade route. And Havana was at the heart of it. Now, despite the defenses of El Morro Castle, there was a British invasion. No, not British. It occurred in 1762, and the British actually conquered the island and stayed for 1 year. But at the end of that year, there was a treaty made back in Spain between the Spanish and the British, and in that treaty, they traded Cuba for Florida. And so Spain got to keep Cuba, and the British took Florida. But they realized that more fortifications needed to be built if it was so easy for the British to take over. And so another fort behind El Morro was built, and this is called San Carlos de la Cabaña, which we will also see as we enter, but it's also a very interesting fort to visit. Now, that particular fort was very expensive to build. And when the engineers and architects went back to kind of apologize to King Carlos, and they said, King Carlos, it actually cost several millions of pesos to construct the cabaña. And King Carlos was stunned. How many? He says, give me a telescope. So they give him a telescope. They said, Majesty, why do you need a telescope? Well, for that amount of money, I should be able to see it from Spain. So an interesting thing was occurring in the Hispanic colonies, which did not occur in other colonies. One of them was the number of slaves increased, but in Cuba there was a system called cortación, where somebody could buy themselves out of slavery. And it was easier to buy yourself out of slavery than it was in other colonies. Also, the child of a master and a slave was a free person. And so consequently, from early on, there was a large population of free blacks in Cuba, and that population was involved in commerce and administration. But more labor was constantly needed, and so in the 1700s, large numbers of Chinese were brought into Havana and throughout Cuba to work in the tobacco and in the sugarcane fields. And they were indentured laborers for 7 years. Some of them decided to stay at the end, many went back to China. The abolition of slavery did not occur until 1875, much later than in other places in the New World. And not long after that, all of the Cuban people were interested in getting free from Spain. And one of the great spokespersons of that movement for freedom from Spain was José Martí. He was so outspoken that he was exiled from Cuba and had to go live in New York City. But from there he organized a group of dissidents who inspired the movement for breaking away from Spain. Now, he eventually returned to Cuba and fought for that freedom from Spain and was killed in 1893. He is the great revolutionary hero of Cuba. You will see statues to José Martí in many different places, and he's even on their money. Now, interestingly, Martí was not only a politician, but he was a poet. And he has a lovely poem that starts out like this. I am a sincere man, am I, from the language